According to research, as many as 68% of students in U.S. schools have experienced at least some form of trauma. The American Psychological Association describes trauma as an emotional response to a terrible event. Most trauma seen in today's schools includes physical or sexual abuse, emotional and physical neglect, and witnessing or experiencing domestic violence. However, other less known events can also be linked with trauma, such as the sudden, unexpected loss of a loved one, natural disasters like hurricanes, tornadoes, and earthquakes, or man-made disasters such as war or domestic and international terrorism. Even the global COVID-19 pandemic can be considered as a potentially traumatic event for an individual or a group of individuals. For an event to be labeled as traumatizing to a person, the incident or issue must be perceived by the individual as aversive, terrifying, shocking, sudden, or it could potentially pose a threat to one's safety or personal integrity. Many people say that trauma is experienced through the eye of the beholder, meaning that what may be traumatizing to one person may not be to another. It all depends on how an individual experienced the situation. Therefore, it's important to remember that exposure to certain events can lead to trauma. However, the impact of the trauma lies within the perspective of the individual. We should never assume that all students will respond similarly to all events. Next, let's talk about how trauma is screened. Adverse childhood experiences, also referred to as ACEs, are a subset of childhood conditions that have been found to consistently correlate with long-term negative effects, such as health and heart disease, high blood pressure, suicide, drug use, etc. The term ACE is used to describe types of abuse, neglect, and other traumatic childhood experiences that may have a negative impact on the health and well-being of an individual later in their life. ACEs were first identified in a large study conducted by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, and Kaiser Permanente's San Diego Health Clinic. The purpose of their study was to assess the long-term impact of childhood abuse and household dysfunction in relation to short and long-term health, disease risk factors, quality of life, healthcare utilization, and mortality. The purpose of their study was to assess the long-term impact of childhood abuse and household dysfunction in relation to short and long-term health, disease risk factors, quality of life, healthcare utilization, and mortality. Findings from the study showed that students who have experienced ACEs are often in great need of developing social and emotional knowledge to process their traumas and the necessary skills to address any potential challenges or triggers that may be associated with childhood traumas. Neurobiological research indicates that exposure to repeated and chronic trauma does negatively impact the brain, often making it difficult for students to access higher-order cognitive processes, which are critical to learning, social, and emotional regulation. Put simply, trauma can impact a person for the entirety of their life. Now that we know a little bit about trauma, let's dive deeper into the different types of trauma. Trauma can be experienced in multiple forms. Examples include acute, chronic, complex, developmental, secondary, and collective trauma. Acute trauma is described as a short-term, unexpected, single incident. Acute trauma can include experiencing a car accident, the sudden loss of a family member, or survival of a natural disaster event such as a tornado or a hurricane. In a school setting, acute trauma can also include the seclusion and/or restraint of a student. Other school trauma can include acts of school violence, such as shootings or even the unexpected loss of a classmate. By contrast, chronic trauma includes repeated and prolonged exposure to traumatic incidents. For example, a student who is continuously subjected to domestic violence in the home, including abuse, neglect, homelessness, or continuous starvation due to a lack of food. In a chronic trauma situation, the events occur more than once and over a period of time, sometimes spanning years. In addition to these types of traumas, when an individual is exposed to varied and repeated traumatic events, it is known as a complex trauma. Complex trauma events include repetitive physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, neglect, witnessing domestic violence, exposure to community violence, and medical trauma that occurs over an extended period. Developmental trauma can be acute, complex, or chronic. The main criterion for developmental trauma is the effect the trauma has on the developmental processes. This form of trauma can impact a child in several different areas, including, but not limited to, interference with peer relationships, social skills, school success, and a sense of self. During the developmental years of childhood, such chronic childhood traumatic stress can also have profound consequences on a child's attachment, emotional and behavioral regulation, and cognition and learning. Meanwhile, secondary trauma, also referred to as vicarious trauma, includes traumatic stresses that have been found to impact those who have indirectly experienced the traumatic event, such as an individual witnessing a traumatic event or an individual who's experiencing the behaviors or emotions exhibited by a trauma survivor. For example, someone may experience vicarious trauma from consoling a victim crying from memories of previous abuse. In some cases, if the individual aids the survivor during the actual trauma, they can also experience similar stress reactions as the trauma survivor. For example, someone who helped victims in a severe car crash, or rescue a worker who worked on the site of the World Trade Center during the 9/11 U.S. terrorist attack. It's not uncommon for educators to experience secondary trauma. Teachers typically encounter students who have experienced trauma more so than most other occupations, such as therapists, because these students are often undiagnosed, identified, or treated. Because teachers are on the front lines working daily and consistently with students in all settings, one-on-one, small groups, or the whole class, these teachers are likely to have students who have experienced trauma. Such repeated exposure to trauma means these teachers are more susceptible to developing secondary trauma. Secondary trauma can also occur because of responding to a student's emotional and behavioral crisis, as well as hearing about trauma that was experienced by the students. Not surprisingly, this type of trauma contributes to the reported emotional burden, stress, and anxiety among teachers. Finally, let's discuss collective trauma, which includes instances where a group of people of any size experience a traumatic event at the same time, but not necessarily when they are directly together. Examples may include a school shooting, natural disasters such as a hurricane or an earthquake, a terrorist attack, or experiencing a violent crime. The COVID-19 pandemic is another form of collective trauma that also resulted in traumatic experiences for countless families. The COVID-19 pandemic resulted in mandated closures of businesses, churches, and schools across the United States, and because of this, families across the country began to face persistent economic implications. The impact of the pandemic created a significant social, emotional, and financial stress for families due to challenges in attaining necessities and appropriate medical care. Although the impact of COVID-19 may be minimal for some students, it may present itself as an ace for others. Aside from the stressors of the pandemic described earlier, researchers state there is emerging evidence that several forms of ACEs increased during the pandemic. For example, the National Institutes of Health and the New York Times covered the rise of partner violence during the pandemic because individuals were in lockdown at home with an abusive partner, resulting in the abuse worsening under the circumstances. Although there is limited information on students witnessing this violence, Google searches during that time period demonstrated an increase in phrases such as, "My mom beat me," "My dad hit me," and searches about how to report and identify child abuse. In addition, a study from the Kaiser Family Foundation found an increased risk in parent mental health challenges and substance abuse because of school being closed, social isolation, job loss, and income insecurity. These behaviors are also identified as ACEs, pointing to long-term negative health effects on students.